Hello and welcome to another video blog edition of the Drazen Report. Thanks so much for watching. Just a quick note to those of you who have subscribed on my website to my mailing list. It is a two-step process. You will receive an email where you will have to confirm that it is in fact you, that it's not someone trying to spam you. So if you don't complete that second step, you will not be on my mailing list. So please keep that in mind. Please watch out for the second email. Now I want to talk about the Azov. They're clearly in their last days. You've probably heard about it elsewhere, but this is a big deal because the Azov were not necessarily in terms of their battle qualities, but just in terms of their mythology around them and their esprit and elan and so forth. They were really considered to be the most exclusive and elite unit of the entire Ukrainian military. Now, I say military, I do not say army. The Azov was not under the Ukrainian army. It was part of a parallel power structure under the Interior Ministry that was established as a sort of a political backup army, similar to the SS in Germany during the 1930s. A little bit about the history of the Azov. How did it start? Well, in 2014, it's very important to understand that the Maidan at the time, revolution, coup, whatever you want to call it, I don't care. I'm not making any judgments now. What happened was there was a very aggressive and violent minority that took power within a large country, the Ukraine, where for the most part, people were politically inert. They were politically inert and demoralized, and they had largely checked out from politics because politics did not present any avenue to improving their lives. And within that context, a very aggressive and violent minority seized power in March of 2014. And that minority very quickly found that the army was on the fence. Okay, because the army at that time, a lot of people expected that Russia would go in and clear things up, right? Clean things up, at least take the entire Donbass for itself, if not beyond the Donbass. And so a lot of people, most people probably expected that at the time. And on top of that, the officer corps within the Ukrainian army, they didn't know if they would be purged or what, right? Because it's a new regime, it's a revolutionary regime, and they just didn't know what to think, right? So they didn't feel confident that they would still be getting paid, basically. And, we know that people will follow their paychecks, basically. I mean, 99% of the time, people will just do what they get paid to do. And the army wasn't really clear on what the score was at that point. They didn't feel confident in the new regime. They didn't know if it was going to last. They didn't know if Russia was going to go in. They didn't know if they were going to be purged or what. So they were the army officer corps down to the enlisted and the draftees. They were not initially loyal to the new regime, not to mention that the new regime, they were firebombing, they were throwing Molotov cocktails at draftee soldiers on the Maidan, and some of them died. So it was, clearly they were basically had a rebellion in Kiev where they were very viciously attacking the army, including 18-year-old draftees that were just sent there to just guard guard downtown, and all of a sudden they're in charge, and they're in charge of the army. So again, a very, very kind of weird political situation where people didn't know what to expect. And so the army initially really failed to control the rebels in the Donbass. So if ever, a lot of people who have been following this since 2014, they recall that the real rebellion in the Donbass as a military rebellion, not just civilian protests, but as a military rebellion, it started in Slavyansk, which is in the northern part of Donetsk province. And in Slavyansk, there were there was basically essentially a platoon of rebels that took charge of the city. And they were able to take, there weren't many of them, but they were able to take charge because they had popular support. And what the civilians did was there was a convoy of light armored, sort of low caliber artillery vehicles. I believe they have something like 30 millimeter cannon on them, but they're these very small small, low-profile armored vehicles with light cannon on them called Nonas. Soviet era weapons, and there was a convoy of Ukrainian army Nonas that was passing through or very close to Slavyansk, and a large crowd of up to 1,000 civilians came out, blocked the road, and talked the soldiers on those Nonas off of the Nonas, and basically commandeered all of that equipment. And then, of course, all of it went to the rebels. So basically you had 4 or 5 Ukrainian army armored artillery vehicles that went over to the rebels just immediately without a fight, and the soldiers sort of just disappeared. And that was considered to be a very, very big embarrassment. There were other such incidents, but that was the biggest and best documented, where the army sort of just melted away. And again, very embarrassing. And at that point, the new regime, the revolutionary regime, realized that, hey, we cannot count on the army. So what they did was they facilitated establishment of a parallel armed structure. They created something called the National Guard, which actually had existed. There was something under that name that existed shortly after Ukrainian independence in the early 90s, but it was sort of done away with. But they reestablished something called the National Guard that was under the Interior Ministry. It was intended to be a sort of parallel army that would be more politically loyal to the to the Maidan and to the sort of Ukrainist agenda of this pure non-Russian Ukraine. And they very quickly began hiring guys for the ranks of this National Guard who were had records with various far right movements and so-called far right. I mean, they're not really conservative or anything like that, but these nationalist aligned, Nazi aligned movements. A lot of the guys in those types of movements, football hooligans and those types of people, they made it over to the National Guard, were given a uniform and a paycheck, and Uncle Sam was funding all of it, and they were happy. Then they were very quickly sent to the Donbass. They were given, in some cases, American weapons, Humvees, M16s, and didn't really look like Ukrainian soldiers, at least initially, and were given a bunch of donated surplus American equipment. And they were sent to the Donbass to sort of back up the army, because the army, again, wasn't doing very well. But at that time, the National Guard was still not enough. So what happened was a bunch of oligarchs, Eastern and Central Ukrainian oligarchs. There was the most famous one is Kolomoisky. He's the best known here in this country. He was Ukraine's basically #1 Jewish person. He's a very big billionaire businessman, very ruthless, and he also is a very big Jewish philanthropist. Well, again, he's basically Ukraine's #1 Jewish citizen. He and some other oligarchs decided that, hey, we're going to get bigger into politics by way of creating our own little private armies here. They're going to be loyal to us. And what they did was, among others, they created several different these volunteer units. So there were these sort of amateur militias that were basically had no legal existence, no legal legitimacy at all, but they basically was these gangs of guys that got together and just went to the Donbass and try to shoot things up and find some rebels and shoot them up, basically. And for the most part, they were engaged in looting washing machines and stealing furniture and beating people up and things like that. But that's how these these so-called, far-right volunteer units got their start. And one of those units was the Azov, and they were initially funded by these oligarchs, including Kolomoisky, who basically saw that as a sort of political army in his pocket, and sort of a way to build credibility with the Ukrainian nationalists, so he could further his business and political empire. And so the Azov originally was battalion size. It was not much more than 300 men. And they did what they could to support the Ukrainian army initially, but they got their asses handed to them a couple of times by the rebels and then by the Russians. And then they sort of retreated from the northern and central Donbass and made their way south to Mariupol and became sort of this Mariupol garrison, basically this army that was non-army army that was occupying Mariupol, which is basically a Russian city. I mean, it's there's no Ukraine in Mariupol, but they basically became this occupying garrison to keep the locals in line. And they grew and they grew. And then what happened was towards the end of 2014 and into 2015, the Ukraine decided that, hey, we need to get these guys under control because they're just volunteer units. They're like doing their own thing. They're not under any control at all. So what they did was they brought them under the National Guard, under the Interior Ministry, right? And so they all became official. Now they all became legal and legit, right? Like Doc Holliday in Tombstone, and so they were. But despite the fact that they were, legalized and made a part of the Interior Ministry, they didn't have to give up their Nazi attributes and all the regalia and everything. So they kept their SS Second Armored Division, Das Reich Division shoulder patch. The SS shoulder patch, they kept that. They continued to recruit guys with, from neo-Nazi clubs and movements, and people with a lot of Nazi tattoos. And we're seeing that now because they're coming out as prisoners, and Russia's making them take off their shirts so they can photograph and video the tattoos. And it's all pretty embarrassing if you care, right? I mean, if you don't care. If you're the American media, you're not going to see it, right? You're not. So we have here the Washington Post, and this is from last Friday, Friday, May 13th. And I actually paid $2 for this, big mistake. But anyway, it says, "Steel plant, a symbol of valor and terror." Steel plant, a symbol of valor and terror. And inside on page 810 is a couple of thousand words, about the Azov defending Mariupol. But they don't really say this Azov, except in one little sentence where they say that the Azov is a nationalist unit that is despised by President Putin. So Russian President Vladimir Putin despises the Azov, and that's it. The rest is their heroes, the heroic defense, and oh my God, it's so hard for them, and they're dying, but they're still holding out, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And so it's thousands of word article, and it barely mentions that, okay, they're nationalists, Putin doesn't like them, so I guess they must be good guys if Putin doesn't like them. I mean, who in Ukraine does Putin like today, right? Not many people. So that doesn't really tell you anything. Keep in mind, the Washington Post, I lived under Trump for 4 years. They were, at least until the corona came around, they were telling us that white supremacy, white nationalism and Nazism is the single biggest threat to the world, basically. The biggest threat to civilization is white nationalism and white power. And so they were, they were looking for any hint of it anywhere, any hint of, oh my God, this is white nationalism, So they were saying that if someone like made the AOK sign or something like that, that it was like white power. And there was this Hispanic construction contractor who was driving a truck, driving his company, his employer's truck in LA or somewhere in California. And he had his, just kind of resting his arm out of the window of the truck, and he had they supposedly had his fingers like this, and they said it was a white nationalist symbol, and he got fired. So they were like on a witch hunt, for years, looking for any hint, any shade of white power, white supremacist Nazism, but they can't seem to find it in Ukraine. I mean, these guys all have Nazi tattoos, they have the Nazi, SS shoulder patch, but somehow they're just nationalists. It's all good. It's all good. I mean, they were literally founded by some of the worst Nazis in the Ukraine, but those guys kind of stepped out when the Azov was legitimized under the Interior Ministry. So those guys they were forced out. But nonetheless, it's, the Nazi air or aura sort of remained. I mean, all these guys, all these Azov guys have beards because they try to look like Vikings. They have this Norse mythology around them. They have their Nazi tattoos. It's been very well documented. Basically, the way that Russia says, if it takes prisoners in Mariupol and it makes them take off their shirt, and if they have Nazi tattoos or SS tattoos or something like that, then they're Azov. And They also have their official or semi-official anthem of the Azov is a song that goes that's called in Ukrainian. It's called "Батько наш Бандера, Ukraina Mati," which means our father is Bandera and Ukraine's our mother. Now, who was Bandera? Bandera was the head of the Ukraine rebel army during World War II. Who was one of the biggest Jew killers in Ukrainian history, very successful Jew killer, very accomplished, and also responsible for the Volyn genocide against the Polish population in the Northwest. But he's become a Ukrainian national hero, but particularly a hero for the Azov. There's all sorts of graffiti, swastika graffiti, Black Sun graffiti, Batko Nash Bandera graffiti on walls in Mariupol. It's all over the place. But again, our media here, they don't notice. They don't notice because it's they don't want to notice. They if some guy was some guy was going like this, in America 3 years ago, they'd say it's white power and they get him fired. And now they don't notice anything in Ukraine. It's just Azov. Well, it's just nationalists. Putin doesn't like them. So anyway. So they were incorporated into the originally this volunteer unit just of basically football toughs and hooligans and just assorted Nazi scum, and they were given they were brought into the power structure under the Interior Ministry, and originally the forces of the Interior Ministry, the National Guard. Now keep in mind. They were not people. Everyone thinks, the Azov are the Nazis in the Ukraine. No. There's a lot of these Nazi-oriented battalions and units under the Interior Ministry in the National Guard who are not the Azov. Okay, there's the Tornado Battalion, there's the Donbass Battalion, there's a bunch of others. The Azov just happens to be the most successful and the largest. And when they say it's a battalion, it's not a battalion. When they say regiment, it might be called a regiment formally, but it's a lot bigger than a regiment, okay? Because they're not just in Mariupol, they're throughout eastern Ukraine, from Kharkov down to Mariupol. So they're right now, you've got hundreds of Azov guys that are fighting the Russians in Kharkov province. And so they're well beyond, it's not well beyond Mariupol, but Mariupol was their home base. And I would guess that between the armed personnel, the uniformed personnel, and all the civilian support staff, and the various people running all their businesses and everything, because let's face it, this is the Ukraine. Probably they had upwards of 10,000 people that were either, one way or another, drawing their paycheck as Azov people, and so really much bigger than a regiment, or certainly bigger than a battalion. Battalion is like 300 men. Okay, a regiment is 2,000 to 3,000. The Azov is much bigger. So the Azov was sort of the 600-pound gorilla within the Interior Ministry's National Guard component. But there were a lot of others. But Azov again was most successful. Why? Potentially because they were given this home base where they were a garrison, in Mariupol. It basically became essentially a government within a government in Mariupol. That was their city. No doubt they had their own cash flows there and revenue streams. And by Ukrainian standards, it was a pretty rich city. I mean, it's a huge, massive industry in there, very lucrative, shipping and so forth. And no doubt they had their finger in that pie, and they were able to grow and, get their Azov mugs and Azov T-shirts, and here's your Azov pen and your Azov welcome pack, and, by the way, we have an Azov health spa and a country club and all that. And, it's like God only knows how they acquired all that wealth and all that real estate, but it's been well documented that the Russians have gone in and found all these places. So, but again, the Azov and Nazis in Ukraine are not interchangeable. There are many other Azov type units within the National Guard under the Ukrainian Interior Ministry. They're just simply, Azov was the most successful and the best in terms of business and PR and all that. Now, as I've said, they were a state within a state. And they were also, the Interior Ministry as a whole, again, was this political backup army, because originally back in 2014, the army was seen as politically unreliable, weak, and it needed some sort of a backbone, and that would be provided externally by this politically vetted political backup army that came under basically the Interior Ministry, which again is very similar to Nazi Germany during the 1930s and the 1940s. So history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme, as they say. So now they're being physically taken apart. They're being denazified. When Russia says, well, okay, we'll denazify the Ukraine, I mean, this is what they mean. They want to kill these guys, or at least take them prisoner and take them out of the equation, take them out of the military and political equation inside the Ukraine. And they're doing an excellent job of that. And these guys are now coming out. There were a couple here and there that surrendered in Mariupol in the past, but today, Monday, May 16th, as of when I'm recording this video, they are finally coming out in large groups. There was this morning there was a group of 51 that came out, of whom about 40% were non-ambulatory wounded. But then later in the day, there was talk of now hundreds are coming out. So by the time you see this, it may be that most of them have surrendered already. This isn't necessarily something that's going to happen all in one day. But it basically, the writing is on the wall. They're surrendering. The Azov is surrendering. A huge propaganda blow to the Ukraine. Again, this was the most elite Ukrainian unit. It was the backbone of the entire military structure of the Interior Ministry, which, by the way, was traditionally at odds with the Ukrainian army, right? Just like in Nazi Germany during World War II, you had the SS was competing for the Führer's attention. It was competing for resources. It was competing for personnel, for funding, and the same thing in Ukraine. Same thing. They had a rivalry between the army and the Interior Ministry. Finally, the Interior Minister was basically this longtime warlord guy who had been around since 2014. He had treated the place as his own private fiefdom. And they almost came to blows with the regular army last year, and finally he was at the intervention of the U.S. ambassador. He was removed. He all of a sudden, 3 days after meeting with the U.S. ambassador, he sent in his resignation letter, effective immediately, and he disappeared. And I've never heard from him again. This guy Avakov, I don't think he's even in the Ukraine right now. So. Zelensky's office won out. They finally took charge of the Interior Ministry, got rid of this J. Edgar Hoover type who had been hogging it for 7+ years. So now now it doesn't matter so much, because basically they're all on the front lines now. But there was a lot of tension between the Ukrainian army and the office of the president on the one hand, and the Interior Ministry and the Azov in particular on the other. In my opinion, Russia's doing Ukraine a favor by killing these guys. It's very unfortunate that these guys that are non-ambulatory wounded, that are now surrendering, that they're being carried out on stretchers, and they're obviously going to be medevac to Russia and given the best medical treatment that the Russian taxpayer can provide, and they'll probably be used for propaganda purposes over there. It would have been better just to leave them all there in the ground. But we have the Geneva Convention, so you have to follow it. Anyway, that's all I have to say about the Azov. Hopefully, shortly after today, we will not be hearing much more from them. Thank you so much for watching.